Sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wearing the mask of friendship, and sometimes the people who destroy our lives actually set us free to discover who we were always meant to become. I'm Eleanor, and I've spent decades collecting stories that prove the human heart can triumph over even the most calculated evil. This morning, while organizing documents at the Hartford Historical Preservation Society, I discovered something that took my breath away: a sealed envelope marked, "For those who understand that grace conquers all," tucked inside a first edition of Pilgrim's Progress. Inside were letters that tell the most extraordinary story of betrayal and redemption I have ever encountered, written by a woman whose closest friend stole not just her fortune but her very identity, forging documents that would have destroyed anyone with less faith and determination. This is the true story of Margaret Ashbury, a woman who lost everything to the person she trusted most, only to discover that sometimes we must be stripped of everything we think we need in order to find everything we were truly meant to be. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you considered family? Have you discovered that the person you trusted most was secretly working to destroy you? Share your story in the comments, because Margaret's journey will show you that even when evil seems to win, grace always has the last word, and justice delayed is never justice denied. Richmond, Virginia, in the crisp autumn of 1838, was a city where magnolia trees lined cobblestone streets that had witnessed the birth of a nation, where federal-style mansions stood as monuments to prosperity built on tobacco and trade, and where society moved with the measured grace of people who understood that reputation was more valuable than gold and that a lady's good name was her most precious inheritance. Margaret Ashbury stood at the tall windows of her drawing room on Franklin Street, watching carriages pass through dappled sunlight that filtered through ancient oak trees, while she reviewed the correspondence that had arrived with the Morning Post, including letters from the various charitable organizations that had come to depend on her generous spirit and capable leadership in addressing the needs of Richmond's less fortunate citizens. At 40 years old, Margaret possessed the kind of refined beauty that had deepened with maturity, her auburn hair arranged in the elegant style that reflected both her position in society and her understanding of appropriate fashion, her intelligent gray eyes revealing the depth of character that had made her one of Richmond's most respected and admired ladies, and her graceful bearing speaking of the education and moral training that had prepared her to fulfill the duties and responsibilities that came with her position as the widow of one of the city's most successful merchants. The house on Franklin Street had been Edward Ashbury's wedding gift to his bride, filled with the finest furniture that money could purchase and decorated with the kind of artistic taste that demonstrated both wealth and culture, but it had become much more than a display of prosperity during the 15 years of their marriage, serving as a center of hospitality and charitable activity that had touched hundreds of lives and earned Margaret a place in the hearts of everyone who had been blessed by her kindness. Edward Ashbury had been one of Richmond's most successful importers, building his fortune through careful investments in shipping and trade that had connected Virginia's agricultural products to markets throughout the world, while his marriage to Margaret Sinclair had united two families whose names had been respected in Virginia society for generations, creating a partnership that had been based on genuine love and mutual respect, as well as the practical advantages that came from combining their resources and social connections. Edward's sudden death from pneumonia the previous winter had left Margaret not only grieving the loss of her beloved companion but also facing the challenge of managing an estate and continuing the charitable work that had given meaning to her life while adapting to the loneliness and uncertainty that had become her daily reality as a woman alone in a world that expected widows to retire from active participation in society. The inheritance that Edward had left to Margaret had been substantial but not overwhelming, including the house on Franklin Street, a modest portfolio of investments that generated enough income to maintain her comfortable lifestyle, and various business interests that required careful management to preserve their value while providing the resources she needed to continue the charitable activities that had become her passion and her purpose. Margaret's approach to managing her inheritance had been cautious and thoughtful, consulting with trusted advisors while also educating herself about financial matters that Edward had previously handled, determined to honor his memory by preserving what he had built while using their resources to continue serving others in ways that reflected the values they had shared throughout their marriage. The friendship between Margaret and Lydia Crowell had begun several years earlier when Lydia had arrived in Richmond as a young widow seeking to rebuild her life after losing her husband in a shipping accident that had left her with limited resources but unlimited determination to create a place for herself in society despite her lack of family connections or inherited social position. Margaret's natural compassion had been touched by Lydia's apparent vulnerability and her obvious intelligence, while Lydia's charm and enthusiasm had brought energy and liveliness to Margaret's sometimes solitary existence as a woman whose childless marriage had left her without the family obligations that occupied most ladies of her age and social position. Lydia Crowell possessed the kind of striking beauty that immediately attracted attention in any gathering, with golden hair that she arranged in fashionable styles, brilliant blue eyes that sparkled with apparent warmth and interest in others, and a vivacious personality that made her the center of conversation wherever she appeared. But beneath her charming exterior lay a calculating intelligence that had been shaped by years of poverty and social exclusion that had taught her to view relationships as opportunities for advancement rather than sources of genuine affection or mutual support. Lydia's background, which she had carefully edited in her presentations to Richmond society, had included years of struggle and humiliation that had left her with a burning determination to achieve the security and status that she believed would protect her from ever again experiencing the helplessness and desperation that had characterized her youth. The development of Margaret and Lydia's friendship had been gradual and seemingly natural, beginning with casual encounters at social gatherings and charitable events, progressing through shared work on various community projects, and deepening into the kind of intimate relationship that allowed them to confide their hopes, fears, and private thoughts about the challenges and opportunities that faced them as women trying to create meaningful lives in a society that offered limited roles and expectations for their gender. Margaret's trust in Lydia had grown from her observation of what appeared to be genuine kindness and moral principle, while her generous nature had made her eager to share her advantages with someone who seemed deserving of help and friendship. Lydia's envy of Margaret's position and possessions had been carefully hidden behind expressions of gratitude and admiration, but it had been growing more intense with each passing month as she had observed the ease and security of Margaret's life while comparing it to her own constant anxiety about maintaining appearances and finding resources to support the lifestyle she believed was necessary to achieve her goals. Lydia's resentment had been focused not only on Margaret's material advantages but also on the effortless respect and affection that Margaret commanded from everyone who knew her, a social standing that seemed to come naturally to someone who had never experienced the desperation and humiliation that had shaped Lydia's understanding of how the world actually operated for people without inherited advantages. The campaign of destruction that Lydia had begun against Margaret had been subtle and carefully planned, starting with seemingly innocent comments about Edward's business practices and the source of the Ashbury family wealth, suggestions that perhaps not everyone understood the complete truth about how Edward had achieved his success and whether all of his dealings had been entirely honest and above reproach. Lydia's talent for spreading doubt and suspicion while maintaining her own appearance of loyalty and concern had been remarkable, as she had managed to plant questions in people's minds without ever making direct accusations that could be challenged or refuted, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and speculation that had gradually begun to affect how others viewed Margaret and her family's reputation. The rumors that Lydia had skillfully cultivated had focused on suggestions that Edward's death had not been as sudden and natural as it had appeared, that he had been facing financial difficulties and legal problems that would have become public if he had lived longer, and that Margaret's calm acceptance of widowhood indicated either coldness of heart or knowledge of secrets that would explain her lack of apparent grief over losing someone who was supposedly the love of her life. These whispers had been spread through the network of social relationships that connected Richmond's ladies, each repetition adding new details and speculation that made the stories more believable and more damaging to Margaret's reputation and standing in the community. Margaret's initial awareness of the change in how people were treating her had been gradual and confusing, as social invitations had become less frequent. Conversations had seemed more strained and artificial, and the warm friendliness that had always characterized her interactions with neighbors and acquaintances had been replaced by polite but distant courtesy that suggested people were uncertain about how to treat her or what to believe about her circumstances. Margaret's attempts to understand what had changed had been met with evasive responses and awkward silences that had made it clear something was wrong but had not provided any clues about the nature of the problem or how it might be addressed. The period of social isolation that had followed the spread of Lydia's rumors had been particularly painful for Margaret because it had coincided with her deepest grieving for Edward and her need for the support and companionship of friends who could help her navigate the practical and emotional challenges of adjusting to life as a widow. The invitations that had stopped coming had included events and activities that had been central to Margaret's social life and charitable work, leaving her increasingly isolated from the community connections that had given structure and meaning to her days while also cutting her off from the informal networks of information and support that had always been available to women of her social position. Lydia's offer to help Margaret manage her financial affairs had been presented as a gesture of friendship and concern from someone who could see that Margaret was struggling with the complexities of business matters that she had never been required to understand while Edward was alive to handle such responsibilities. Lydia's apparent expertise in practical matters had been convincing, supported by her claims about experience gained during her own widowhood and her obvious intelligence about social and business relationships that seemed to qualify her to provide guidance to someone who was less worldly and sophisticated about such matters. Margaret's decision to accept Lydia's assistance had been motivated by her trust in their friendship, her genuine need for help with unfamiliar responsibilities, and her relief at having someone she could depend on during a period when other relationships had become strained and unreliable for reasons she could not understand. Margaret's gratitude for Lydia's apparent loyalty and support during such a difficult time had made her even more willing to rely on her friend's advice and assistance, while her own grief and confusion had made it difficult for her to think clearly about practical matters that required careful attention and sound judgment. The process by which Lydia had gained access to Margaret's financial records and legal documents had been gradual and systematic, beginning with requests to review specific papers that were needed for immediate decisions and expanding into general authority to handle correspondence and transactions that Margaret found overwhelming or distressing to manage personally. Lydia's requests had always been accompanied by expressions of concern for Margaret's well-being and arguments about the importance of protecting her from stress and difficult decisions that could worsen her emotional state during such a vulnerable period of her life. The forged documents that Lydia had created during her time as Margaret's financial manager had been sophisticated and convincing, demonstrating skills that she had acquired through careful study and practice, as well as connections with unscrupulous individuals who had provided technical assistance in exchange for shares of whatever profits might be generated by their criminal collaboration. The forgeries had included bills of sale for portions of Margaret's property, loan agreements that created debts that had never existed, and correspondence that appeared to document business relationships and obligations that justified the transfer of assets to accounts that Lydia controlled. The systematic theft of Margaret's estate had been accomplished through a series of transactions that had been designed to appear legitimate while actually transferring ownership of valuable properties and investments to entities that Lydia had established using false names and forged documents. The complexity of these arrangements had been intended to make discovery difficult and to provide Lydia with legal protection if questions were raised about the legitimacy of her claims to ownership of assets that had originally belonged to Margaret. Margaret's discovery of Lydia's betrayal had begun with small inconsistencies in financial statements and correspondence that had seemed confusing but not necessarily alarming, progressing to more serious questions about missing documents and unexplained transactions, and culminating in the shocking realization that her trusted friend had been systematically robbing her while maintaining the pretense of loyal service and genuine concern for her welfare. The evidence of Lydia's crimes had been devastating not only because of the financial losses but also because of the complete destruction of trust that had been central to Margaret's understanding of their relationship. The confrontation between Margaret and Lydia when the extent of the theft had become clear had revealed the depth of Lydia's hatred and resentment, as she had abandoned her previous facade of friendship and concern to express her true feelings about Margaret's privileged position and her belief that someone who had been given so much without effort or sacrifice did not deserve to keep advantages that could be better used by someone who had worked harder and suffered more to achieve success and security. Lydia's justification of her actions had been based on her conviction that Margaret had been naive and careless with resources that she had inherited rather than earned, and that redistributing this wealth to someone who would use it more effectively was not theft but justice. Lydia's departure from Richmond had been swift and well-planned, occurring during a period when Margaret had been away visiting relatives and could not interfere with the final stages of the asset transfer process that completed Lydia's theft of the Ashbury estate. The letter that Lydia had left for Margaret had been a masterpiece of cruelty, expressing satisfaction at having taught Margaret a valuable lesson about trust and naivety while also warning her that any attempts to pursue legal remedies would only result in further humiliation and exposure of information that would complete the destruction of her reputation and social standing. Margaret's immediate response to the discovery of her complete financial ruin had been a period of shock and despair that had required all of her inner strength and faith to overcome, as she had faced not only the practical challenges of surviving without resources but also the emotional trauma of realizing that her closest friend had been planning her destruction for years while maintaining the pretense of love and loyalty. The depth of the betrayal had been more devastating than the financial losses because it had challenged Margaret's fundamental assumptions about human nature and the possibility of genuine friendship and trust between people who claimed to care about each other's welfare. The decision to leave Richmond and seek refuge elsewhere had been motivated not by shame about her circumstances but by her understanding that remaining in a community where she was surrounded by people who had believed lies about her character would make recovery more difficult and would subject her to continued humiliation that would serve no constructive purpose in her efforts to rebuild her life. Margaret's departure had been quiet and dignified, with only a few loyal friends aware of her plans and destination, as she had wanted to avoid the gossip and speculation that would have accompanied a more public acknowledgement of her changed circumstances. The countryside in where Margaret had found temporary shelter had been a modest establishment that catered to travelers and temporary residents who needed simple accommodations and basic services rather than luxury or social amenities. But it had provided Margaret with the peace and privacy she needed to assess her situation and develop plans for her future that would allow her to survive and eventually thrive despite the devastating losses she had suffered. The inn's location in a small town where she was unknown had given her the anonymity she needed to think clearly about her options without being influenced by the opinions and expectations of people who knew her history and might judge her current circumstances. The meeting with Mr. Langford had occurred by chance when Margaret had been taking one of her solitary walks through the countryside surrounding the inn, seeking the kind of natural beauty and tranquility that had always helped her find peace and perspective during difficult times, and had encountered an elderly gentleman who had been sketching wildflowers beside a stream that meandered through meadows where cattle grazed peacefully under oak trees that provided shade and shelter from the afternoon sun. Their initial conversation had been casual and polite, the kind of exchange between strangers who found themselves sharing a pleasant location, but had gradually developed into more serious discussion as Mr. Langford had recognized Margaret's intelligence and refinement despite her obvious distress and reduced circumstances. Mr. Langford's background as a retired solicitor who had spent decades dealing with cases involving fraud and deception had given him insights into human nature and criminal behavior that proved invaluable in understanding Lydia's methods and motivations, while his knowledge of legal procedures and documentation had enabled him to recognize the sophisticated nature of the forgeries and schemes that had been used to steal Margaret's estate. His offer to assist Margaret in gathering evidence and pursuing justice had been motivated not only by professional interest in an unusually complex case but also by personal admiration for someone who had maintained her dignity and moral principles despite suffering such a devastating betrayal. The investigation that Margaret and Mr. Langford had conducted together had been careful and systematic, designed to gather irrefutable proof of Lydia's crimes while also uncovering the full extent of her criminal activities and identifying other victims who might have suffered similar losses at her hands. Their work had required months of patient research, correspondence with officials in various jurisdictions, and analysis of financial records and legal documents that revealed the intricate web of deception that Lydia had created to support her theft and fraud. The discovery that Lydia had victimized other women had been both shocking and encouraging, as it had demonstrated that Margaret was not the only person who had been deceived by Lydia's charm and apparent trustworthiness, while also providing additional evidence and witnesses that would strengthen the case for prosecution and recovery of stolen assets. The pattern that had emerged from their investigation had shown that Lydia had been operating her fraud scheme for several years, targeting wealthy widows and other vulnerable women who possessed significant assets but lacked the business experience or social connections needed to protect themselves from sophisticated financial manipulation. The evidence that Margaret and Mr. Langford had assembled had been comprehensive and devastating, including original documents that proved the forgeries, witness testimony from people who had been involved in various aspects of Lydia's schemes, and financial records that traced the movement of stolen assets through the network of false entities and fraudulent accounts that Lydia had established to conceal her crimes. The preparation of this evidence for legal action had required careful coordination with law enforcement officials and attorneys who had the authority and expertise needed to pursue criminal prosecution and civil recovery of the stolen property. You know that moment when you realize the person you trusted most has been plotting your destruction all along? Margaret's world shattered when she discovered that Lydia had been forging her name and stealing her life piece by piece, but what happened next proves that sometimes our greatest betrayals prepare us for our most powerful victories. Her story reminds us that wolves don't always look like wolves, sometimes they look like our dearest friends, wearing smiles while they sharpen their claws. If you've ever been deceived by someone you considered family, or if you've had to rebuild your life from the ashes of someone else's betrayal, I'd love to hear about your journey in the comments. These experiences of betrayal and recovery connect us all, because they teach us that our true strength isn't measured by how well we trust, but by how beautifully we rise when that trust is broken. The year that had passed while Margaret and Mr. Langford had been gathering evidence had also been a time of personal healing and spiritual growth for Margaret, as she had gradually recovered from the shock and trauma of Lydia's betrayal while also discovering inner resources of strength and resilience that she had never needed to access during her comfortable years as Edward's wife. The simplicity of life at the countryside inn had taught Margaret that happiness and peace did not depend on material possessions or social status but on having a clear conscience and meaningful work to do, while her friendship with Mr. Langford had restored her faith in the possibility of genuine human goodness and loyalty. Margaret's transformation during this period had been both external and internal, as her initial despair and confusion had been replaced by determination and clarity about her purpose and goals for the future, while her understanding of herself and her capabilities had been expanded by the challenges she had faced and overcome during the most difficult year of her life. The woman who had been protected and sheltered during her marriage had discovered that she possessed the intelligence, courage, and moral strength needed to fight for justice and to rebuild her life on foundations that were more solid and meaningful than anything she had previously known. The plan for confronting Lydia and exposing her crimes had been developed carefully to ensure maximum impact while also protecting Margaret and other victims from potential retaliation or attempts by Lydia to escape justice by fleeing to locations where legal pursuit would be difficult or impossible. The timing of the confrontation had been chosen to coincide with a grand social event where Lydia would be surrounded by the Richmond society that she had cultivated during her time as a wealthy and respected member of the community, ensuring that her exposure and disgrace would be as public and complete as possible. The grand ball that Lydia had been hosting at the mansion she had purchased with Margaret's stolen money had been intended as the ultimate display of her success and social triumph, a lavish entertainment that would demonstrate her wealth and taste while also solidifying her position among Richmond's elite families who had accepted her as one of their own based on her apparent prosperity and charm. The guest list had included many of the same people who had participated in spreading the rumors that had destroyed Margaret's reputation, making the event perfect for the kind of dramatic revelation that would force everyone to confront the truth about both Lydia's crimes and their own participation in Margaret's social destruction. Margaret's appearance at the ball had been a masterpiece of timing and presentation, as she had arrived during the height of the evening's festivities when all the guests were gathered in the main ballroom and Lydia was basking in the admiration and attention that she believed confirmed her successful transformation from desperate widow to respected society hostess. Margaret's entrance had been noticed immediately because of her unexpected presence at an event where she would not have been welcomed under normal circumstances. But her elegant dress and composed demeanor had made it clear that she was not there to create a scene or to embarrass herself through inappropriate behavior. The sealed letter that Margaret had presented to the assembled guests had been carefully prepared to provide a clear and comprehensive explanation of Lydia's crimes while also revealing the broader pattern of deception that had affected multiple victims and had been made possible by the willingness of Richmond society to accept gossip and rumors without seeking verification or considering the harm that such behavior could cause to innocent people. The dramatic moment when the letter was read aloud had created the kind of shocked silence that occurs when people are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own behavior and the consequences of their failure to think critically about information that confirmed their prejudices or satisfied their appetite for scandal. Lydia's reaction to the exposure of her crimes had been a complete collapse of the sophisticated facade that she had maintained throughout her time in Richmond, as the charming and gracious hostess had been replaced by someone whose desperation and fury revealed the true nature that had been hidden behind years of careful performance and manipulation. Her attempts to deny the accusations and to discredit Margaret's evidence had been undermined by the presence of Mr. Langford and the official documents that provided irrefutable proof of forgery and theft, while her obvious guilt and panic had convinced even those who might have been inclined to give her the benefit of any doubt. The swift action of law enforcement officials who had been prepared in advance to arrest Lydia and secure evidence from her residence had prevented any possibility of her escaping justice or destroying additional proof of her crimes, while the coordination with officials in other jurisdictions where she had operated similar schemes had ensured that all of her victims would have opportunities to recover their stolen property and see that appropriate punishment was imposed on someone who had caused so much suffering through her calculated cruelty and greed. The legal proceedings that had followed Lydia's arrest had been thorough and efficient, resulting in convictions on multiple charges of fraud, forgery, and theft that had carried substantial prison sentences and had required the return of all stolen assets to their rightful owners. The publicity surrounding the case had served as a warning to others who might be tempted to prey on vulnerable widows and had also prompted changes in legal procedures and banking practices that would make similar crimes more difficult to commit and more likely to be detected before they could cause devastating losses. Margaret's recovery of her stolen property had been more complete than she had dared to hope, as Mr. Langford's meticulous investigation had enabled authorities to trace and recover assets that Lydia had attempted to hide through various schemes and false transactions, while the cooperation of banks and other financial institutions had helped to reverse fraudulent transfers and restore Margaret's legal ownership of properties and investments that represented the foundation of her financial security and independence. The restoration of Margaret's reputation had been equally satisfying, as the revelation of Lydia's true character and criminal activities had forced the people of Richmond to acknowledge their own mistakes in judgment and to recognize that they had been manipulated into participating in the persecution of someone whose only crime had been trusting a friend who had proven herself unworthy of such trust. The apologies and expressions of regret that Margaret had received from people who had believed and spread Lydia's lies had been gratifying but had also confirmed her understanding that popular opinion was unreliable and that true worth was not determined by social acceptance or approval. The decision to transform her restored estate into a sanctuary for women who had been betrayed and abandoned had been inspired by Margaret's own experiences with loss and recovery, as well as her recognition that many other women were facing similar challenges without having access to the resources and support that had made her own survival and eventual triumph possible. The vision for Ashbury House of Grace had been to create a place where women could find not only shelter and practical assistance but also the emotional and spiritual support needed to rebuild their lives and regain their confidence after experiencing devastating betrayals or losses. The establishment of Ashbury House of Grace had required careful planning and substantial financial investment, but the resources that Margaret had recovered from Lydia's theft had provided the foundation for creating something far more meaningful and lasting than the comfortable but relatively purposeless existence she had lived during her marriage, when her charitable activities had been limited to occasional donations and social obligations rather than the kind of systematic and comprehensive service to others that became her life's work after her restoration. The women who had found refuge at Ashbury House of Grace had included widows who had been cheated by dishonest business partners, wives who had been abandoned by husbands who had stolen their dowries and inheritances, daughters who had been disinherited by families who disapproved of their choices, and other victims of various forms of financial and emotional abuse who needed both practical assistance and emotional healing to rebuild their lives and regain their independence and self-respect. The programs that Margaret had developed at Ashbury House had included not only housing and basic support but also education and training that would enable residents to develop skills and knowledge that could provide them with economic independence and personal fulfillment, while the community of mutual support that had emerged among the women had created lasting friendships and networks of assistance that continued to benefit them long after they had left the residence and established independent lives. Margaret's own role at Ashbury House had evolved from founder and administrator to mentor and spiritual guide, as her experiences with betrayal and recovery had given her insights into the process of healing and transformation that proved invaluable in helping other women navigate their own journeys from victimization to empowerment. Her ability to understand and empathize with their pain while also providing hope and practical guidance had made her uniquely qualified to serve as both an example of what was possible and a source of the support and encouragement that were essential for success in rebuilding lives that had been shattered by cruelty and betrayal. The reputation that Ashbury House of Grace had developed throughout Virginia and neighboring states had attracted not only women who needed its services but also supporters who recognized the importance of Margaret's work and wanted to contribute resources and assistance that would enable the institution to expand its services and help even more people who were facing similar challenges. The network of relationships that had grown around the house had created a community of advocates for women's rights and protection that had influenced legislation and social policies in ways that extended the impact of Margaret's work far beyond the individuals who had been directly served by the institution. The recognition that Margaret had received for her work had included honors and awards from various organizations, but the satisfaction that had meant the most to her had come from the letters and visits from former residents who had written or returned to share news of their successes and to express gratitude for the help and support that had made their recovery possible. These testimonials had provided clear evidence that the house was achieving its goals of helping women not just survive their crises but emerge from them stronger and more capable than they had been before experiencing the traumas that had brought them to seek assistance. The philosophy that had guided Margaret's work at Ashbury House had been based on her understanding that grace was not something that was earned through good behavior or deserved through virtue, but rather a gift that was offered freely to all people regardless of their circumstances or past mistakes, and that the most important qualification for receiving grace was simply the recognition of one's need for it and willingness to accept it when it was offered. This understanding had enabled her to work with women whose backgrounds and experiences were very different from her own, while also helping them understand that their worth was not determined by what had happened to them but by how they chose to respond to their circumstances. The spiritual dimension of Margaret's work had been central to her approach, as she had recognized that the wounds inflicted by betrayal and abuse went deeper than material losses or social humiliation and required healing that addressed not only practical needs but also the spiritual and emotional damage that could make it difficult for victims to trust again or to believe in their own worth and potential for happiness. The chapel that had been built at Ashbury House had provided a place for quiet reflection and prayer, while the regular worship services and Bible studies had offered opportunities for residents to find strength and comfort in their faith. The educational programs that Margaret had established had included not only practical skills like bookkeeping and domestic management but also broader instruction in literature, history, and moral philosophy that was designed to help women develop the intellectual confidence and cultural knowledge that would enable them to participate fully in society and to protect themselves from future exploitation by people who might try to take advantage of their lack of education or sophistication. Margaret's belief in the importance of education for all women, regardless of their social class or background, had been ahead of its time and had contributed to gradual changes in attitudes about women's capabilities and rights. The economic independence that many Ashbury House residents had achieved through Margaret's training programs had been one of the most satisfying aspects of her work, as she had seen women who had arrived completely dependent on charity develop the skills and confidence needed to support themselves and their children through honest work that provided both income and personal fulfillment. The network of employers who had worked with Margaret to provide opportunities for former residents had created a system of support that had ensured that women leaving the house would have realistic prospects for continued success and security. As the years passed and Margaret's work at Ashbury House had become well established and widely respected, she had also had opportunities to reflect on her own journey from comfortable widowhood through devastating betrayal to meaningful service and purpose that had given her life more meaning and satisfaction than she had ever experienced during her years of social privilege and material comfort. The losses that had seemed so catastrophic at the time had ultimately become the foundation for discoveries about herself and about the possibilities for human resilience and transformation that had enriched her understanding of what it meant to live a truly successful and fulfilled life. The legacy that Margaret had created through her work at Ashbury House had been both institutional and personal, as the residents had continued to serve women in need long after her death, while the example of her own recovery and transformation had inspired countless other people to believe in their own capacity to overcome adversity and to find meaning and purpose in serving others who faced similar challenges. The stories of the women who had been helped by her work had been preserved and shared as testimonies to the power of grace and compassion to heal even the deepest wounds and to create new possibilities for happiness and fulfillment from the most unpromising circumstances. Margaret's understanding of grace as something that was not earned but freely given had been the foundation not only of her work with others but also of her own recovery from the trauma of Lydia's betrayal, as she had gradually learned to forgive not only her enemy but also herself for the naivety and trust that had made the betrayal possible. This forgiveness had not meant excusing or minimizing Lydia's crimes, but rather refusing to allow those crimes to define or limit Margaret's own potential for growth and service to others who needed the kind of help that she was uniquely qualified to provide because of her own experiences with loss and recovery. The final years of Margaret's life had been marked by the deep satisfaction that came from seeing the lasting impact of her work and knowing that the pain and loss she had experienced had been transformed into something beautiful and meaningful that would continue to benefit others long after she was no longer alive to provide direct guidance and leadership. The women who had been trained as her successors had carried forward not only the practical aspects of operating Ashbury House but also the spirit of grace and compassion that had made it a place of genuine healing and transformation rather than simply a charitable institution that provided temporary relief from immediate problems. The memorial service that had been held for Margaret had been attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her work, including many former residents of Ashbury House who had returned to honor the woman who had believed in them when they had been unable to believe in themselves and who had provided them with the tools and support they had needed to rebuild their lives and discover their own capacity for strength and resilience in the face of adversity. The testimonials that had been shared during this service had created a powerful portrait of someone whose own suffering had been transformed into a source of healing and hope for others who faced similar challenges. The continuation of Ashbury House of Grace under the leadership that Margaret had trained had ensured that her vision would survive and continue to evolve to meet the changing needs of women who faced betrayal and abandonment in different forms but who still needed the same basic support and encouragement that had been at the heart of Margaret's approach to helping others recover from trauma and rebuild their lives on foundations of strength and self-respect. The broader impact of Margaret's work had included its influence on laws and policies that provided better protection for women's property rights and made it more difficult for unscrupulous individuals to exploit vulnerable widows and other women who possessed assets but lacked the legal knowledge or social connections needed to protect themselves from sophisticated schemes of fraud and theft. The publicity that had surrounded Lydia's crimes and Margaret's recovery had contributed to increased awareness of such problems and had helped to create support for legal reforms that would benefit future generations of women who might otherwise have faced similar victimization. As I hold these precious letters that document Margaret's incredible journey from devastating betrayal to triumphant service, I'm filled with awe at the power of grace to transform even our deepest wounds into sources of healing for others. Margaret's story teaches us that sometimes the people who steal our lives actually set us free to discover who we were always meant to become. Her friendship with Lydia cost her everything she thought she valued, but it led her to discover everything that was truly valuable: the strength to stand alone, the wisdom to help others, and the grace to transform pain into purpose. What moves me most about Margaret's story is how she understood that grace isn't for the innocent, but for those who have walked through darkness and refused to become it. When she opened Ashbury House of Grace, she wasn't just creating a refuge for broken women, she was building a testament to the truth that our greatest betrayals can become our most powerful preparation for serving others who face similar battles. Margaret's confrontation with Lydia at that grand ball wasn't just about exposing a thief, it was about reclaiming the truth and showing an entire community that their judgment had been as flawed as their gossip had been cruel. She didn't just get her money back, she got her life back, her reputation back, and most importantly, her purpose back. And she used all of it not for revenge, but for redemption, not just her own, but for every woman who came after her. Have you ever had someone forge your name, steal your identity, or betray your trust so completely that it shattered everything you thought you knew about human nature? Have you discovered strength you never knew you had after someone you loved tried to destroy you? Maybe you've found, like Margaret did, that your greatest pain became the source of your greatest purpose. I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, and if you know of other historical accounts of people who transformed betrayal into blessing, please share those suggestions too. These conversations help us all understand that we're not alone in facing these devastating betrayals, and that healing is always possible when we choose grace over bitterness. If Margaret's story has shown you that even the most calculated betrayals can become stepping stones to our greatest victories, please subscribe to hear more tales of people who refuse to let their enemies define their destinies. Your support helps me continue preserving these stories that prove love is stronger than hate, truth is more powerful than lies, and grace always has the final word. I'm Eleanor, and I preserve these stories because they remind us that our scars can become our credentials, our pain can become our purpose, and our betrayals can become the very foundation of our most beautiful victories. Margaret Ashbury proved that when someone forges your name and steals your life, you have the power to reclaim both your identity and your legacy, and to use them in service of something far more meaningful than anything your enemies tried to steal.